Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Ellis. What I'm talking about in this series of videos is the idea that the diet-heart connection has been falsified. We've been lied to over and over and over, and everyone's in collusion over this. So it's very difficult for anyone to get the real information because they put the walls around the wagons and they won't let the real facts come out because there's too many people feeding it that trough. Now, in the age of the internet and blogs and videos, we can get the information out, but people are going to have to pay attention. Now, the media are involved in the process of keeping us in the dark. They're in cahoots with all these major organizations like the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the American Heart Association, and all these other associations and physicians and government who want to keep this thing going on. Now, the important key to understand about the idea of having diet be linked with heart disease is that most of the studies that were completed, which were beginning in the 1950s, were looking at the diets that typical people followed. Now, the typical diet that most people follow is what we call the supermarket diet. That's a diet made up of a mixture of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. There was no real effort to separate the foodstuffs and change the percent composition of the diet mix to see what would happen under those conditions. That is what's going on today, and that's where I'm going to head in this series of videos to show exactly what's going on today and what we're finding out. Because what was found is that there was not a link. In fact, the American Heart Association in 1957 formed a group of scientists to evaluate all the existing data on whether or not there was a link between diet and heart disease. And they concluded that there was not. That's the scientific report. There was not a link. The American Heart decided to sit on that and not release those findings. And finally, in 1961, it did not release those findings. It set out to tell all Americans that cholesterol and fat were, in fact, the cause of heart disease, and recommended that everybody follow a prudent diet in which they would reduce their cholesterol and reduce their saturated fat. That was one of the first main steps. As I've mentioned before, in 1984, there was a consensus conference held in Washington in which they kept all the dissenters out. And that started the national mania over cholesterol, and everybody joined. The media, physicians, drug companies, the government, everybody joined this movement promoting this idea. And this idea became so entrenched that everybody believes it today, even though none of it's true. There's no proof behind it whatsoever. And you and your loved ones will suffer if you follow the recommendations that are currently promoted about diet. And that's the sad news. So that's one of the things I'm trying to overcome. And of course, this is all anti-establishment stuff, and I am anti-establishment. There's no surprise there. So this juggernaut just kept on rolling then through the 80s and the 90s, and the education programs continued, and everybody talked about healthy eating. Healthy eating meant reducing the amount of saturated fat you consumed, the bad fat, and consuming more polyunsaturated fat because that was considered the good fat. Of course, when you do that, you get cancer. So there's a downside to all that, and you don't hear any of that information. And all these different clinical trials that they spent billions of dollars on showed nothing. So they used trumped up statistics and just kept misinterpreting and saying whatever they wanted to say, regardless of what the results were, to convince everybody that there was, in fact, a link between diet and heart disease. Now, there is a link, not the one they were looking for, and that's what I'm going to move toward in this series of videos, that there is a link between diet, but certainly not the diet that people have been consuming for the last 100 years with the mixed composition of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So we're going to get into all that, and we're going to get into what the actual scientists are discovering, not medicals, not the medical professionals, not the medical doctors. I don't consider them scientists. Obviously, some MDs do become scientists, but most are not. And the scientists are doing the hardcore work in the field, in the lab, gathering the information we need to understand why diet composition might be important to us and what is the real cause of heart disease, and we'll get a handle on all that. So stick with me on this. You'll get the whole scoop. You'll know the whole story. There's a ton of books out there. There's a ton of information written on the internet. All you have to do is search the term cholesterol myths, and you'll find an unbelievable amount of data that has been published and talked about by all of those who know that this is a fraud. So you don't want to continue to be conned, because that's not going to do you any good. So you got to be open to these ideas, and you can't keep believing what the establishment is telling you, because they're not going to let this thing go easily, not easily at all. So I'm Dr. Greg Ellis, and that's the story on fat and cholesterol and heart disease.